and welcome to Competencies in Civil Discourse, where we talk about the importance and efficacy of rhetoric, civil discourse, in a free and liberal society. I'm Erec Smith, a research fellow at the Cato Institute and former professor of rhetoric, which can be defined as the study of persuasive communication. Each episode, we've talked about the efficacy of rhetoric in various disciplines, as well as society at large, but we have yet to talk about visual rhetoric, which is why I'm very excited to have Ildi Tillmann with us today. Ildi Tillmann was born in Hungary, but is now a New York-based photographer, author, and educator whose art spans documentaries, narrative journalism, and commissioned photography, placing human stories in a global context. Today, we will talk about the power of visual rhetoric to deliberate, convey ideas, and facilitate multimodal civil discourse. Thanks for joining us today, Ildi.
It's a pleasure to be here, Erec.
Now, I have a list of questions here that I'm really looking forward to asking, but I want to let the audience know that if they want to ask questions, they can submit those questions to our website, Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. It's up to you. But now it's my turn to ask the questions. So, Ildi, I see that you have a bachelor's/law degree from ELTE in Budapest and a master's in Africana Studies from SUNY New York. And you even took trips to Haiti during your time as a master's student. What is the value in studying a culture different from your own and your own lived experience?
Well, the simple answer to that I would give, of course, is that you learn something new, right? Like you go out of your bubble, you move outside of your comfort zone, and you're going to actually see something new. But I think that's a very simplified answer. And if I may say that, I think that, maybe today's conversation, one of the themes is going to be how academic approach and academia and sort of studying different things, like studying a culture, is not the same as actually really learning about that culture or learning about something. So, I think that a more precise answer would be, it's not simply that you move out of your comfort zone and you learn something new, because what is really important is how you approach that, like how you approach the other culture. And what I mean by that is, like, you need to have an openness to actually learn. I think I would connect that to perhaps, and I know that we wanted to talk about that later, so I will bring that a little bit to the front of the conversation, about the importance of speaking other languages, of being able to connect with people in their own language, and why that is really a crucial part for me, at least as an artist and as a documentary maker, to be able to connect, right? So you don't talk through through an interpreter, but you speak with somebody who actually, or you speak through a tool, through a medium that communicates that culture already. So I think I'm going off on a tangent, but you see, why is it important to learn these, to study a culture? I think for me personally, what is important is not to study a culture. I think what's really important is to be immersed in that culture. And that's a very difficult thing to do if somebody goes to a place as an academic or as a researcher, as somebody who goes and say, okay, now I'm going to study this culture. I like to compare this to the difference between visiting a place as a tourist and then visiting a place, or not visiting a place, but let's say living in a place for a year, right? You somehow start to be immersed in the culture of that place. And I think that's a big difference. So, the question itself, I would probably reframe the question, like, why is it important to approach a culture with an openness and not to study a culture? Because when we study a culture, we bring our own perspective. We bring our own biases, in a way, if you want to use the academic jargon. But what it really means is that we are bringing a certain worldview, a certain way of looking at things that were taught to us in our own culture. And that's what I feel, is that many times that prevents a dialogue. So it's not going to be a dialogue. It's just like, again, you're going as a tourist somewhere, you're projecting your own, you sort of take in what's, prescribed in the guidebook, and, you go here, you go there, you see this, you see that. I did this, you're correct. I went to Haiti as an academic. And maybe that's a good story to tell here. So the first time that I was in Haiti, and I went there during my graduate research years as a researcher, right? Like diligently preparing, how am I going to talk to people? How am I going to interview them? And my topic was the importance of rhetoric, like religious rhetoric in Haitian politics. So in the beginning, I went and, I had interviews set up with academics, with like voodoo priests, for religion and all of that. And I had a wonderful, wonderful partner there that I worked with, a journalist, a local Haitian journalist, who I think just helped me so much realize, like, come out of this academic bubble already the first time that I went there. And I remember the two of us going, and I wanted to interview a voodoo priest. And of course, again, sort of our image is like, oh, you're going to interview a voodoo priest. This is going to be something, first of all, somebody who's very intellectual, somebody who thinks a lot about, the way the word is, the way we think about it, and who's going to have the same questions about spirituality and how, the relatable word, or the sort of the seeable word, the tangible word, and the invisible word connect. And I went there and I started asking him questions. And this was a person who lived in a small village, of course, very formally, not non-educated formally, but he was the priest. And I started asking him all of these questions that in academia you would ask about the religion. And I could see a little bit on his face, there was this hesitation. And then my partner, who at this time I did need a translator because the person didn't speak French. So we spoke in Haitian Creole. So I did need the translation. And then the Haitian journalist turns to me and just like quietly tells me in French, he's like, he has no idea what you're talking about. He says, these are not the things that he's ever thinking about. And it was just such like a revelation to me. I'm like, I'm sitting here bringing all of these questions that I think are important, or that we think, in academia that are important, and trying to project that as something that's important in that person. So that was a very revealing situation to me. And that was actually the moment when I realized, okay, what I want to do is really not to have an academic approach or sort of a studying approach to other cultures, but I want to have an approach where I simply document what I see. I observe what I see. I try to be as immersed as possible. And that means a lot of the time you don't necessarily ask questions. You just sit there, you just watch, you just observe or absorb whatever you see. And in my belief, this is how you actually start learning to know a different culture.
Yes, in academic jargon, what you're talking about is the difference between edic research and emic research. The former being sitting in an office somewhere far removed from the culture you're reading about, reading about it in a chapter, in a textbook, and actually immersing yourself in that culture. But I have to ask, when you immerse yourself in that culture, and by doing that, you develop the proper ethos to be trusted by the people you're working with, how do you maintain a sufficient level of objectivity when you're embracing the subjective experience of that culture?
That's a very academic question.
Sorry.
No, that's very good. That's good. So a level of objectivity. So, okay, where do I start with this? So another thing, okay, that I sort of learned over the past, let's say 15 years, right? Like starting out in academia and then moving to photojournalism, and now it's sort of like just to photography, or mostly doing photography. I still do documentary, but it's mostly visual, right? Mm-hmm. Is that there is a very strong emphasis in academic speech on sort of rules and measurements, and like this idea of objectivity. And of course, objectivity is important, but I don't believe that we can, like in human interaction. So I make a very big difference between like the natural sciences, where I think objectivity can be achieved better,
Yeah.
and humanities, where, and don't get me wrong, when I'm not trying to or going to try to say, oh, there is no objective truth. There are definitely facts, even in human life, humanities, absolutely there are facts. But I think it's undeniable that the way we relate to facts and then the way we understand the facts that are out there, that is always going to be subjective. So I think to give an answer is like how I maintain objectivity. I don't believe I can maintain objectivity. What I can do, the best I think I can do, is to really allow myself to open up to different perspectives and to absorb those perspectives. And by absorb, I don't mean that I identify with them or that I'm going to agree with them, but I will have my own perspective and I will allow the other perspective to reach me. And then we can have a conversation at that point.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers the question,
Yeah,
but I think that's really, yeah, so that's really the best. And that, again, is something that I learned in the Haitian context when I went as a researcher, that, you know, the best conversations and the most informative conversations happen when they happen instinctively, when they happen naturally, when they are not necessarily planned. And if you follow all the rules of academic research in humanities, you know, when you have these like ethical boards, and I'm not saying there's no reason to have them, but if you have to follow all the rules and you have to ask permission for everything in advance, then you really don't allow any kind of, you know, like any kind of instinctive or sort of you know, like non-organized encounter to happen. And I believe that that is what makes partially academia be unrelated to real life, because real life is about, it's not about the rules. It's about how we actually connect and how we communicate, sort of despite those rules, right? Or sort of outside the framework of those rules.
Okay. And I wanted to talk to you about, you know, the unreality of academia a little bit later on, but it seems like a nice time to talk about it
seems like
now.
it came off, right?
We're already well into that conversation, so why not
Okay.
continue it? How can academia, or think tanks for that matter, be more relevant to real-world experience and real-world emic research?
Yes, that's a tough one. And honestly, I'm not going to be able to give you the answer to that, like how. How can they be more relevant? I think one of the problems of, you know, contemporary academia, I don't want to talk too much about think tanks because I have never worked for or in the context of a think tank, so I don't want to assume how things work there.
Okay.
I know a little bit more about academia because I spent some years there. I think it's, again, like the idea that we have to regulate everything, it really makes it very difficult to stay relevant. So how academia could be more relevant? Less regulation, I would say. Encourage more honest conversations. You know, I mean, we can go into all of that. I don't want to. It's not going to be the solution. I think the short answer really is I don't know the solution. The system already has its own inertia, right? Like its own bureaucracy, and why people have to do things like certain ways that they do it. Yeah, I don't think I can tell you how it's going to be more effective. All I know is that the ideas that currently, I think, especially the administrative ideas that rule academia, what it means to have a safe space, how do you actually have to teach, what is it allowed, what's allowed to say and what's not allowed to say, that's definitely not going to help academia become more relevant. And just to give you one example to that, like how I sort of went around that problem and tried to maybe be more relevant to life. When I taught a course for one semester about the Black experience at Stony Brook University, And this was after 2020. I believe it was 2022, if I remember correctly. So this was a time when you had to be really, really careful, like how you teach and what you say. And because I was there only as an an adjunct, right? Like in some ways I had not much to lose in terms of my career, because I knew my career is not going to be there. And what I simply did, I think I opened up the space um, to different perspectives. And I'm trying to avoid using the word liberal education, because in the US currently that has like there's such a political meaning attached to that, like
Right.
liberal. What I mean by liberal is that you can voice and you want to create a safe space, yes,
Yes.
for different perspectives.
Yes.
So I encourage the students to have conflicting views, to talk about those conflicting views openly, to bring them up in class. So in a way, coming around it a little bit is like, let's redefine a safe space, if you want to use the jargon, because the students have grown up with that jargon. So, you want to sort of be relatable. So a safe space is not a space where some people feel that they cannot say what they think, and then other people feel that, whatever is being said there is not going to trigger my emotions. That's not an academic safe space, right? Like that's a therapeutical safe space. So I sort of encourage them to have an academic safe space, which in my view is conflicting opinions. Let's talk about that respectfully, patiently, and that's one way. I don't think I can answer the question how we can really make it, because the system is already like, there's so much inertia in the system. I don't know how to change that. Maybe some other smarter people will come up with the solution.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, no one else seems to know how to answer that question either. I think you gave a very good question, especially the distinction between academic and therapeutic, which is something that people conflate these days. Academia is definitely having a low point, right, in its time on this planet, really. And I don't know how things are going to go. But what I do know is that you have found another way of teaching, and that is through not just visual rhetoric, right, but documentaries. So let's talk about the research you've done and the documentaries you've done. You have a series on Haiti and more recently on Cuba. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, and you make an effort to focus on the common threads and themes that connect humans across time and space. Why do you feel it's important to highlight these threads? And how do you balance that focus on connection while still honoring each country's unique culture?
Okay, very good question. So again, the very simple answer is, why is it important? Because people don't do that, right? We don't do that, especially as a culture, in North American culture. The contemporary zeitgeist doesn't highlight that, or if there is a highlight, or if there is an emphasis on sort of the shared humanity, it's merely rhetorical. They, they're going to say, oh yeah, we want to respect the shared experience, but it either means that they have like some commercial globalist agenda that, they want to push on everybody, that, we are all, they have a much more commercial motivation to do that, or they pay lip service to that, but actually what's happening is, identity politics, right? So the reason that I thought it's really important to talk about this from a different perspective is because we're not doing it. And the reason we're not doing it can be also, like, there might be different motivations. One of them is political. It just doesn't serve politicians to talk about it. But the other could also be that I think that the similarities and the differences between different cultures, ethnicities, countries, social groups and all that, can come along lines that people don't expect. And because they don't expect that, they don't know that. And I'm going to give you an example. And I bring that example up a lot when I talk about my trips to Haiti, right? So before I went to Haiti, I had already been living in the US for, I don't know, like maybe 20 years almost. And I came out of academia and all that. So when I started talking to people about me going to Haiti, the sort of natural response to that was like, oh my God, like that's going to be such a different experience. Like, you know, as a white woman, you're going to be shocked. And I'm like, okay, maybe yes. But so what that showed me and what it reflected was just how much people in this country and in this context are not aware, like they attach a very local meaning and a very politicized meaning to a skin color and to the specific experiences that a person with a specific skin color might have. And of course, at the same time, they talk about, oh no, we want to humanize everybody. And, you know, like we are all about human connectivity. But then the first reaction is, oh, as a white woman, this is what you're going to experience. So I went to Haiti, right? And again, I want to remind the audience, I grew up in Hungary, right? At the time, it was still communist Hungary. It was not the sort of hardcore era of the dictatorship. So this was in the 70s and the 80s in Hungary, but we did live in a sort of, they called it socialism by that point, a communist socialist sort of like cultural sphere, propaganda sphere, economic sphere. And we were what was considered the third world, or maybe the second world, if you can sort of wanna do those things. But I definitely did not come from a country that belonged to countries that were rich or well off. And so when I went to Haiti, after the first week, I realized that the stories that I saw there as individuals going through, right? And what I mean is like, how do you function in an economy? How do you function in a social context which is not actually regulated, where there is black market everywhere? How do you function in a place where you don't have rights in the sense that people have? You're not entitled to anything. The only thing you will be entitled to is to hope that the other person who's either giving you a service or supposed to, you know, works for the government and supposed to do something for you, so you can hope that they will do what they are supposed to do. That's exactly the context that I grew up in. So you have to know how to move around, how to function in that. Now, another example, how do individuals make decisions about whether to leave a country, to run away from a country, either for political or for economic reasons? But you are in a country, and that was true for Hungary too, also, right? We couldn't leave that country because, first of all, we wouldn't even receive a passport from our own government. And even if you received a passport from your own government, because as the time sort of advanced in the 80s especially, that was a lot easier, right? We even could get passports easily to Western countries, which is not the case in the 70s. But even if you have a passport from your own country, you cannot leave that country because you need a visa everywhere you want to go. So that's, again, an experience that I have grown up with and I very intimately know. I remember the lines that we used to join, right? You want to go to Germany, even in the 80s, you know, you want to go to Germany or the United States. There is a line in front of the embassy that you stand there or sleep there for like a 24-hour period just to get in, to get an interview. Now, that's very similar in Haiti, right? So these are the personal experiences that I'm talking about, that when I was in Haiti, I felt much more that I was at home. And that is something that I believe is very, very difficult for North Americans to relate to. I mean, sometimes even Hungarians, right? Because all people typically see is like, oh, you know, but they have a very different history, they have a very different culture, they have different skin color, whatever. So the superficial things. But those deeper human experiences, or just to give you another example, which is more at the community level in Haiti, how does a society that came out of many, many years of dictatorship, right? Like dictatorship, like a right-wing dictatorship, and after that, suddenly, sort of there is this open space of like democracy and creation of democracy and the NGOs coming in and the NGOs trying to tell you what to do. This was very similar in Hungary, in Eastern Europe. After the fall of the Soviet Union. It didn't go to the extent with the nonprofits that it is in Haiti, which essentially became a country of nonprofits. But these are experiences that connect me with the people who live there. And if I compare that experience with the experience I had after I moved to the United States, and how much I felt I could connect to the lifestyle, the consumerism, the availability of everything, the entitlement. I could never connect to that. So yeah, I don't know again if this is a good answer to your question, but that's something people don't know. So I think that it's very important to talk about these. It's very important to emphasize these kinds of connections because we are not aware of them and we don't think about them.
It's interesting that you, as a white woman, feel like you have more in common with Haiti than I, as a black man, have in common with Haiti. You know what I mean? I am a product of the United States of America. You know, I am that entitled person you were talking about. In fact, I shared a letter on social media the other day talking about how we don't realize as Americans how entitled we are. And people did not like that. You know, and
yes,
in there,
and actually,
yeah.
I think I saw that post.
Oh,
I
did you?
saw that post.
Yeah,
And
go ahead and
I even
comment
looked
after
at the
this.
comments and, you know, and I looked at the comments. I'm like, yeah, even the comments, they have a point, right? And again, like, just let's just take one step back. And I'm not trying to say that there is no, because, you know, what people are going to say now is like, oh, you're ignoring colonial history. Like, that's the typical answer I get, right? And then in colonial history, of course, like, you know, people of African descent, they were all treated. It's not that I'm ignoring that. It's absolutely not that. But particularly when we start talking about lived experience and the lived experience of people who are alive today, right? Not people who were alive 200 years ago, but the people who are alive today, then in some ways you are right. Like, my lived experience shares, what's the right word? There are more aspects of my lived experience that can make me, or that can facilitate my understanding of certain life situations and daily situations of Haitians today than it is for a Black American. And people can really cancel me for saying that, but I think that that's basically true. And let me give you a different example, that there are like several, right? And again, it goes back to the lived history. Let's take a person from Somali descent, right? Or a Cuban, even a Cuban, right? Like, Somalia was very different because they, you know, there was no Atlantic slave trade, so they don't even fit that kind of sort of image of the Black person. But in Somalia or Ethiopia, right, there was a communist dictatorship, 70s, you know, late 70s, 80s. So, and if you talk, Ayan Hirsiali, right, if you hear her talk about her daily experience of growing up and the state being omnipresent, the state hearing everything you say, the state being always there, like, that's going to be a connection point between her and me, regardless of skin color. And that's going to be true for all the Cubans, regardless of skin color. And that's something that I think, you know, North Americans have a very hard time recognizing or admitting, because it's not within the local paradigm. You know, the local paradigm says that your skin color is going to define your lived experience. And to some extent, yes. To some extent, no. To some extent, it's going to be your class background. To some extent, it's going to be the country that you come from. So,
how do you prepare for talking or working with people who you know are from a particular paradigm, a paradigm that may not align with what you're talking about? A simple way of asking this question is, how do you prepare for a disagreement?
I am not very much in situations like that, I have to say, because I don't, you know, because I left academia, right? I don't have to be in those debates. You know, I don't do debates. I do photography now for a living, and even in like the documentary field, like, don't have to do that. But when before, honestly, I've never been in a very confrontational conversation. And that, again, is probably because I'm not searching out those kinds of conversations. But let's say when I gave many talks at the Africana Studies Department at Stony Brook, right? And you could say that people who are there, particularly the students, But some of the professors also, they might have very different opinions about how they see, social relations or what needs to be done about that. I just said what I told you, right? Like I was not talking specifically about US daily politics. What I was talking about, again, and that's hard to argue with that because in a way that's sort of, and I don't want to use the word left, political left, but you could sort of replace that. But in academia, this is from academia that this whole idea of lived experience and fetishizing lived experience comes from. So when I talk about my lived experience, like, in a way, what are they going to say? So maybe I was also lucky, like I never had a particularly aggressive opponent who, would want to sort of, but I think it helps that I'm not North American, because then they sort of can detach, and I'm going to hate to say the word, but I will say detach my whiteness and whatever people in this country associate with whiteness was really who I am. But that only comes after long conversations. Like I find it's extremely limiting and really knowledge limiting in this country, that the first thing people will see about you is really your skin color. And it's not that they will see, everybody sees that, It's like what Coleman Hughes talks about, like color blindness doesn't mean you don't see it. It's not that I don't see it. It's what kind of political and social meaning you attach to the word.
Yes,
So I think I didn't answer your question again, like how do I prepare? Because I don't have to prepare, but I think I'm trying to say, how would I prepare if I had to do that?
Well, I like your answer anyway, because you bring up the meaning of color in this country, and the fact that not everyone on this planet sees things the way we do. They don't interpret color the way we do. What has been your experience with the juxtaposition of American color consciousness and non-American or non-Western color consciousness?
Okay, that's a good question too. I
Thank
like
you.
that. I'll give you two examples for that, because again, actually from my own background, like there is no color consciousness, right, in Hungary, because everybody is the same. We are all mostly we are all Hungarian. We have the percentage of immigrants who are visibly different from us. Now it's growing a little bit, but like historically it has been very low. So there's that kind of color consciousness. So I'll give you two examples. One of them is a friend of mine who she comes from an Afghani background. Her sort of cultural and religious heritage is Sikh. So they're Sikh Indian, but the family moved to Afghanistan before she was born. So they're sort of from the Sikh community in Afghanistan. And long story, she ended up in the United States. She's a very successful businesswoman by now. And I did an interview with her for a journal. And then we talked about this sort of like the color coding in the US. And I asked her, like, so what do you say to people when they say you're a brown person? And she just looked at me and she said, like, I just don't even bother anymore. She said, in the beginning, I used to correct them that, I'm not a color. She says, I just don't even care anymore. So, and that also sort of relates to what you were asking me about academia and real life, again, right? Or sort of the conversations that the cultural elite has among themselves, and that they think that are like so deep and meaningful, and sort of, and then, you ask somebody who runs a business, who has a restaurant, and who happens to be from this background, and she's like, what do you mean I'm brown? Like, so it's a meaningless label for them.
Yes.
And another example, which I will bring to you, is my husband, my second husband, who's my husband right now. He is a West African Muslim person. And he's somebody who came to the US when he was already grown up, just like me, right? So he was not educated in the US system, and he did not grow up, with all of this, the cultural stuff of the US, the cultural teachings of the US. And sometimes when we have conversations about, we don't have too many conversations, fortunately, about, how people in the US see that. But I mean, he faces it. He came in. So obviously, the moment he moves to the United States, he becomes Black, he becomes African, whatever is defined as African American. And then we talk about religion, and in his part of the world, it's going to be much more religion, for example, that sort of makes the difference. And ethnicity, like ethnicity is extremely important for them. So even if you're of the same religion, even if you're both Muslim, but you come from a different country, you come from the neighboring country, that's already a big difference. You're different, you're not the same. So,
Okay.
if you look at the very traditional way of looking at their culture, it's going to be ethnicity and religion. But it's not that they don't have the color labels. And sometimes, when we talk about the Middle East or North Africa, so sort of the ethnically Arab Muslim population, he refers to them as the white Muslims. And then, and I was like, what do you mean by a white Muslim? And he said, well, a white Muslim is somebody who's not a black Muslim. And I said, so, very logical. And then so he says, well, or no, I told him, like those people would be considered brown here. And he's like, there is no brown. There's black Muslim and there's white Muslim. So this is just an example of, to show you how these labels are all culture connected. They are grounded in the given historical context, in the given cultural context. And I think this, in a way, is a response, or maybe connects to your original question, like how do I still respect the cultural differences? When I advocate or argue for finding human connectivity, because the point is really not to ignore these differences. The people is not the purpose is not to pretend they don't exist. The purpose is really to find the way to connect despite these differences. Like, so how do we sort of, yes, they exist, we respect them, but beyond that, we are also still human. So we can see, it's the we can walk and chew gum at the same time situation, where we can see those differences and we can respect those differences, but that doesn't mean that, one group or the other group is going to have some kind of sacred, status and say, oh, I'm much better than you, or I'm much different, or I have more of a say, or I should have more of a voice because I didn't have that voice. Like, that's also like that approach, I believe, you're never going to change the paradigm that way. What you're going to do is you're going to flip the paradigm on its head. And instead of a certain group having, privileges and voice and whatever, now another group. And whether this is going to be race or gender, because I think it happens also with like men, women, like who has a voice, all of that. So you're not changing the paradigm. You're honestly just in the same cycle. And you have the illusion of changing the paradigm.
Interesting. I want to remind the online audience that they may join the conversation and submit questions directly to the Facebook page, the Cato website, or YouTube or X. So just wanted to remind you of that. Ildi, let's talk about your actual photojournalism, right?
Okay.
We often say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? We've heard that before. In your view, what is the power of photography in communicating an idea or an emotion? What story do you aim to tell through your pictures, and how do you do so?
Wow, there were a lot of questions in this one
Sorry.
question. Yeah, so let's start with the beginning. Ask me the first question again, please.
Yes. In your view, what is the power of photography in communicating an idea or an emotion?
Yeah, so the power of photography obviously is the image, right? So I think if we compare it to let's say language, written or spoken language, it's very concise. You have one picture, and that picture is either going to tell a story or not going to tell a story. So that, I think, is the power of photography. And here I think I really want to talk about, maybe for the audience who are not photographers, sort of the power of the photographer to frame and to convey a message. Because, when the audience looks at an image, and whether that's going to be in the news, in the news media, or in activists, particularly, or, like fundraising events and all of that, they look at the picture, and again, people, this is going to actually go to document the sort of my idea of what a real documentary is, right? People look at an image and they think, wow, that's how it happened. And before I became a photographer, I don't think I realized like how much the photographer can influence of what you perceive as reality simply by angle, by what's in the picture and what's not in the picture. And now everybody's going to, remember this now. If you think about the people coming out of, the pictures coming out of Gaza, right? The photographs of the hunger and then hungry children. So what is in the picture and what's not in the picture? So what is going to tell the message? And the editing. The editing also, like it's going to influence a lot. So photography is extremely powerful because it's concise, it's one image, and it's going to carry, or it can carry, right, a very powerful message. What was the next question?
What story do you aim to tell through your pictures, and how do you do so?
Okay, so what I want to do really comes back to the basic question, connection. So I have seen so many images, and that sort of landed on me, or sort of dawned on me during my academic studies. Like the North American visual tradition, if you want to use the nice word, you would say it's very cinematic, right? So it's very glorifying, and it's also extremely dramatic. So people like drama, people like, it's all, the emphasis is on impact. And you can see it in the news, right? How the news are being reported and all that. So it's all about impact. It's never about just be there and observe. The picture has to give you the right question to ask and already almost the answer. This is not only the visual, right? This is sort of North American culture, I think,
Okay.
not just with the visuals, right, in general. And many of the documentaries, I think, that have come out in recent years, they sort of follow that pattern, right? And I don't really consider those documentaries, in the sense, comes back to objectivity or non-objectivity. While they might be describing facts, the tools they use to describe those facts and to manipulate those facts, or not to manipulate the facts, sorry, to manipulate the audience in how to perceive and how to interpret those facts, that's what I believe makes them more propaganda or, than documentary. And I try to avoid that in my photography. I sort of connect that a lot more in a way to my Eastern European tradition and what's the visual tradition and sort of the documentary tradition in Eastern Europe. And that's a lot more, you're not trying to convey a message. You're trying to describe a situation or a scene that you see. Now, of course, I run into a lot of problems with that here in the American context, because people will sort of think that's boring, right?
Yeah.
You're simply describing something. You're not giving an answer. You're just showing me something. And
my next
you
question was,
expect
how
me.
do Americans respond to your documentaries? That was my next question. So,
Yes.
yeah.
So I'm going there. Again, I don't want to generalize. Like, I'm not going to say every American responds that way, because there are many, many people who actually say, wow, this is really beautiful. This is very raw. This is very powerful. But when I try to either get grants or get more into the institutional settings and, get an exhibition, it doesn't fit this sort of activist or like politically impactful trend. And for that reason, I have a very difficult time, being noticed through sort of institutional channels. And that's why I wanted to say that, like, I'm not trying to generalize and say Americans are not receptive to sort of pictures that have more depth. But I think that people here have been socialized in this idea. And that's, again, part of the problem with, let's say, how in the past 40 years, art granting organizations, like grant makers, have framed what art should be. And that always has to be something, show a social problem and then offer solutions. Now, that's, I think, a basic misunderstanding of what the role of art or even documentary in my mind should be. Because
Okay.
if you offer solutions, then you are already a politician, right? Or a think tank, or like you're a science, you're a researcher, you know, like a scientific person. They will try to offer solutions because that's their job. But I believe that my job as either an artist or a documentarian is not to give answers, it's to encourage people to ask questions and to sort of be in that maybe uncomfortable space where you feel, wow, but I don't have an answer. And that's good, because that's the point where many people can come together and say, see, these are the questions that I have when I look at this image. How
Yeah.
do we see this together? And then we frame the problem, if there is a problem, right? So how do we frame the problem together? And then how can we find a solution? But of course, that goes sort of against the idea of what academic research should be, because, and even journalism today in the US, like that's also like opinion pieces always have to offer a solution at the end. And that goes completely against what I grew up with as journalism and this documentary. You don't offer the solution because your job is to point out a situation and to describe a situation and not take a position in that situation. The moment you take a position, then you're already, then you have a message, right? And that's very trendy today in the US. Yeah, like, do you want me to like maybe mention like a couple of documentary films which I thought were excellent and which I still consider as real
Oh,
documentaries
sure.
in the
Yes,
next,
definitely.
like, yeah?
Yes.
So there are three that I sort of had in mind, and one of them I actually even showed in the course when I taught. It's called The Salt of the Earth. Salt of the Earth, this is about the life, it's a Wim Wenders documentary. He's the director, about the Brazilian photographer. The photographer's name is Sebastião Salgado, but it was very famous. So if you Google that, The Salt of the Earth. And to me, that's a beautiful, beautiful meditation on the human condition. It doesn't take sides. It's not trying to sell you an agenda. It's not going to try to persuade you to, donate money to something or stand up for something. It's simply a discovery and the description of his sort of documentary and artistic journey. The other, like another one, which might be relevant today with the Israel-Hamas conflict, the title is The Green Prince. And The Green Prince, it's a simple parallel interviews. So two people, one of them is Mossab Hassan Youssef, who became sort of like very publicly known recently since the October 7 attacks on Israel, because he's somebody who is the son of one of the main Hamas leaders, like way back, like we're talking like 20 years back. And he became somebody who started working for the Mossad, for the Israeli intelligence agency. So, he also, like, since October 7th, he gave a lot of like public appearances, so people might know him for that. But that's not why I think the documentary is interesting. This documentary was done in 2014, so this is like way, way before all of this happened. And it's parallel interviews with him and with the person who was his handler in the Mossad. And it's how a friendship actually evolved between the two of them. It's very interesting, right? Again, it's a documentary that simply describes, it gives you two different perspectives, and it's not taking sides. There's no taking sides in this. It's a story that's a very complex and interesting human story. So these are sort of just, I think, my ideas on one, like why, like what real documentary should be. And I think it's going to relate also to one of the other questions that I know you wanted to maybe talk about, is why teach through art and documentary, or why include that in the curriculum? And that is why, because that's going to open up space for having questions that you cannot answer. And
Yes.
that's okay.
Yes.
And that's what, sorry,
What,
no, go
no, what were you
ahead.
going to say? It's fine.
Yeah, no, just because I think that that's really, it's essential in human life. So again, if we want to teach in a way that relates to real human life and the real human experience, you are going to be staying with questions that you cannot answer, but you
Yeah.
might want to explore more.
Yes, I do agree with that. Americans are so attached to a problem solution framework that even when they don't really have a solution, they will pretend they do. You know,
Yeah,
maybe they
you
even
have
get
to have a
published.
solution.
Yes. So, so I totally understand what you're talking about with that. We do have a couple of questions from the audience right here that I want to get to.
Okay.
Actually, they're more like statements, but we can respond to these statements. The first one is quick and simple. When someone asks me my race, I say I am from the human race. You heard that one
Yes,
before?
I
Yeah?
love that. Yeah, but you see again, like that would be like the absolute, it's a non-brainer answer anywhere outside of the North American context. Like
Yeah.
when I go back home and I try to explain to my sister, for example, who's like highly educated, she's a high school teacher of literature and history, right? So it's not like she's completely ignorant. And I explain to her the way that, you know, like this whole racial and sort of, you know, universal question is viewed here. She goes like, I don't even understand this.
Right.
So yes, I fully agree with the statement. Absolutely.
Excellent. Yet when you say that, so many people will roll their eyes, you know, because within
Yeah.
their
Well,
particular paradigm,
but
that's considered ignorance.
of course, but that's why, because exactly, it's the paradigm, right? Like this is what the sort of the allowed sphere of knowledge, the allowed sphere of statements can be, that to say that, well, I'm part of the human race, then you're somehow demeaning the experience of, like, you know, the historically marginalized groups and all of that jargon. And I mean, yeah, you could see it that way, you could understand it that way. You know, there's one, okay, if you allow me, did you want to ask the other question? Because I just
No, 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 no. I want you
was,
to elaborate on this one.
yeah, so it's about this, like, how do you understand the question? And there is a painter in Hungary. It's not going to be a tangent, don't worry. It is going to be related. So there was a painter, a female painter in Hungary, and I loved the kind of work she did and how she explains sort of exactly this, the relationship between visual art and the viewer. And she said, you know, when people, because the interviewer asked her, like, what happens when somebody looks at your paintings, but they don't see what you wanted to convey? And then she said, well, what do you mean by what I wanted to convey? She says, you know, visual art is always a dialogue between the painter or the creator and the viewer. And she said, all I can do as the artist is to paint something that I believe is going to give, and again, we come back to the open, just to an open approach, right? Like you can think whatever you think about that. And she said, when a person comes who has, and that's a translation from Hungarian, but I hope the audience is going to understand. So who has an inner universe, which is not very rigid, which is not very tight, right? Then that person will come and that person can see many different things in that picture. And if we happen to be in the same space, we can have a dialogue. Then we can have a dialogue. But she said there are people who have such a rigid, or the word she used in Hungarian was a tied inner universe, like inner thought patterns and all that, that no matter what they look at, they will always see the same thing. Or to put it in a different way, they will only see things that comes from, like they project their inner thoughts on whatever it is that in front of them. It doesn't matter what you put in front of them. And she said that those are the people I cannot have a dialogue with. And I think it relates to this, right? Like when people tell you that, you know, saying that I'm from the human race is somehow racist, that's basically you have such a tight inner thought pattern, like an inner universe, that you cannot see anything different from that. And of course, then it stops the dialogue. Like the moment we say that, we don't communicate. Do you
Yes.
think that it's similar?
Yeah. I mean, well, with any kind of messaging, once you put it out there, it's out there. It takes on a life of its own, regardless of the
Yeah.
intent you had for it. which is the importance, which is why civil discourse is important. You get that feedback and you respond to that feedback and you have a back and forth, and meaning is made through that conversation. You know, that's the beauty of all of this that we're missing by not wanting to talk across differences or things like that. But now I'm going on a rant. Let's go back to
Okay, go
the
ahead.
questions here. And again, this is part question, part statement. Okay. Anonymous says, why is it anybody's business what ethnicity or race or sexual orientation or gender, etc. I am? I don't like putting people in categories. I think the real question is, which status do we belong to? Are you wealthy or poor? It's really about class status. What do you think about that? The socioeconomic as opposed to racial and ethnic or sexual, what have you?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. Yes, I think it's true. Now, of course, it's not only class status. So it's, you know, it's a mixture of many things. But yes, I mean, in contemporary North American culture, there's an absolute obsession with, like, you know, racial status and gender, or, like, you know, sexual status, right? Like sexual orientation status. This is a very rigid system. This is a very rigid inner universe, right? So and I'm not saying this is not true or we shouldn't include those aspects. Of course you include those aspects. But yeah, of course, social status, class, and yeah, in some ways class can be connected to ethnicity, depends on which context you come from. So again, it's a mix. It's all of those. And what we need to have a dialogue is not simply to insist always on projecting our own ideas and the ways that we were taught we need to see the world. And I want to make this clear for the audience. Like, I'm not simply saying that these are only North Americans who do that. Every culture does that. It's just that this conversation was about what are the specifics of North American culture that make it sort of not flexible and not be open to the world. In Hungary, we grew up with of course, there are inflexibilities and sort of cultural dogmas in every culture. And I think and maybe that's why, you see, like, this connectivity issue is so important for me. Because when I still used to live in Hungary, I didn't like that there either. You know, like this sort of obsessive focus on, and it's very similar to sort of the Black community or certain areas of the parts of the Black community doing here, you know, an excessive focus on how Hungarian history was just a series of tragedies and we are victims of that and we're entitled to certain things because of our victimhood. Like, I couldn't tolerate that. So it's not sort of like a specific North American thing. I think it happens. And that's why I think it's so important if we can find these parallels, if we can talk about these parallels, and then we can discuss what that led to. And in some ways, a lot of that is what led to, you know, like the right-wing dictatorships and the World War and all of that. Like, that was the basis of that. So, you know, how are all of these things connected, and how actually the extreme right can have the very same thought structures and patterns that the extreme left? How do we connect that across time? This has already happened.
Yeah.
But how do we see that?
Well, I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. I'm not going to pretend I have an answer for you, but I am going to let you know that I've had a very good time with this conversation. It's been very informative, and I'm sure the audience feels the same way. Is there anything you'd like to say to conclude our conversation today?
No, I think maybe I invite people to visit my website. So that's, if we could, I don't know if we can put that later on, maybe under the recording, or
sure,
put it in the
we
chat.
can. You can also just say it now, though, you know, for good measure.
Okay, it's going to be hard for people. Okay, so it's my name, ildikotillmann.com. ILDIKOT, like Thomas, ILLMANN.com, ildikotillmann.com. So full name and .com.
All right, excellent. And what can
I
they
invite
expect?
people to visit there.
What can they expect from that website?
Well, what they can expect on that website is it's a merger of my commission-based work And it has a link to a different website, which I'm not going to spell now, but it has my artistic work. So it's the two together.
All right, excellent. Well, that is all the time we have for today. I want to thank our audience for joining us for this conversation. I want to thank Ildi Tillmann for joining me for this conversation. It has not been our first conversation, and it won't be our last, hopefully. So thank you very much, Ildi, for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Eric. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you, audience, for tuning in. Have a great day.